Good morning. The last time he introduced me, it was about 1 minute. I think he made up a lot of stuff there, you know. But it's really nice to be here. It's my first time in Monterey, so I hope it's not the last, you see. So the biggest thing you can do for somebody is to invite them back, you know, the second time. I think that's always nice. What I'm going to try and do with you today is just to talk a little about the way we see the future, but not so much about what the future will be, rather how you can understand it from a business point of view. Because I think you know, the future has changed a bit in the last few months, hasn't it? And when we look at the future, I actually don't like this. This is going up and down all the time, isn't it? I'm going to do without it. It's just annoying. Let's try it without it. In Future World, what we have basically is a network of business practitioners. Most of the people in our network were clients of ours at some stage. And over the last 10 years or so, we've helped companies start new businesses. The last time we counted was approaching 200 new businesses over the last 10 years that we've helped people start. And it's always been businesses in new markets or new areas that they hadn't been in before. So we always look for very different ways of addressing the future. The other thing that's interesting about this process is that we found that not only do people create new businesses and make good money, they have a good time. One of the things that I think most of the people in our network don't do it because they want to earn a living. They've done that. You know, but what they love to do is to create something radically different. So I'm going to show you really how we do that. This is not the theory. This is not a university theory of the future. This is how we practically have helped companies understand the future. So that's what I'd like to do. And you know, Deloitte has been a partner of ours worldwide for the last 8 or 9 years. And the brand sort of Future World powered by Deloitte has been a part of that. We work a lot with business schools and also at the University of Oxford in England. If you haven't heard of this 21st century school, you should really have a look at the website. Just go to Oxford University and have a look at this. The studies they're doing about the future, nobody else is doing. It's about the social aspects of the future, you know, everything to do with the future. We do a lot of work with them. Now, the problem with the future is that it's not going to be great. You know, I always compare it to sailing. When you usually go sailing when the weather's good and the sun's out and everything. But if you stay out on the water long enough, you're going to get this kind of weather. It's guaranteed. So the one thing that I think that's important about the future is that it's always messy. You know, it's never this perfect place, and no matter what, when you do business plans, they always look fantastic. But the reality is, it's like the sea. And you know, what's happened the last few months, you know, this sort of credit tsunami is just another example of that. You know, and what surprised me about this was that everybody was surprised. We publish a thing called a mind bullet. Every Thursday we publish a scenario for the future. This scenario we published in May 2005, and we said it would happen in December 2007. And it looks like it came out of the Wall Street Journal, you know, 3 months ago. But this was 2005. So since 2005, we've been talking to the property industry, to the banks, and so on, about this scenario, saying, what will you do when this happens? Not if it happens, but when it happens. And you know, it's interesting to me that we were talking about, you know, properties in Florida and so on. Even the biggest property organizations in the United States, 1 year ago, did not believe this was going to happen. And you know, to me, there's a lesson in this. The more successful you are, the better things are, the less likely you are to think about a future that is very different to the one that you're in. That's the price of success. You actually stop believing the rest of the world and you now understand what's going on. what I'm going to try and do with you is to go back a little bit in history as well. I'm not sure, does anybody remember 1970? What I'd like to do is just go back to that sort of late 60s, early 70s period, because a lot has changed since then. And we forget how much has changed. And I'm going to assume that in the future, for the next 30, 40 years, we're going to have the same amount of change. Do you think that's fair? You reckon it's going to be? Most people say, yes, it's going to increase. But the problem when you say it's going to increase, it gets even more scary. So I'm going to be very conservative, and we're only going to go to the 2020s and beyond. And I'm just going to assume that the rate of change does not increase. And if you're not scared, I'll be surprised. But the question is, what do you do about it? It's fine thinking about these things, but you know, in the end, as a business, you have to act. You have to do something about it. And leadership, of course, is doing something before you have to. Now, if you act when you have to, that's called management. The leadership is about being silly, actually. It's about taking risks. Everybody around you is saying, why is this guy doing this? And you look at the bottom line, it looks great. So to me, so we're going to go backwards, we're going to go forwards, we're going to go forward for a period of about one lifetime. If you think about your life, you know, it's a certain length, you know, probably, you know, 70, 80, 90 years today. But it hasn't always been like that. Just 100 years ago, the average lifespan for a man was 35 years. That was 100 years ago. Now we're used to sort of 70, 80, 90. What happens if that lifespan doubles again? Well, you said to me it was increasing, the speed of change was increasing. So if you can buy something in a bottle that gives you 20 years more life, how much do you think that's worth? And to a 30-year-old, it means nothing. To a 50-year-old, it's worth a little more. When you're my age, it's worth a hell of a lot. So to me, you know, this whole idea of how long we will live and what we will do with that life has changed quite dramatically, and it will continue to change. And so let me just try this game with you, because you know, if you look at your life, every step, your first relationship, the first children that you have, and so on, every one of those changes your life quite dramatically. And you know, we're used to the fact that there are these big step changes. Yet when we plan for the future of our business, we do it in a straight line. The more successful you are, the more of a straight line your business plan becomes. And it's scary, because these steps are everywhere. And you know, to me, we have to look at life a little bit differently. I'm going to try this going backwards and going forwards with somebody you know. Now, he's changed a little bit, hasn't he? But can you see how when we look backwards, we say, okay, so where's the surprise? The surprise may come what happens next. Okay? So what do you think he's going to look like in the 2020s? Well, he's already told you who his design model is, and we think by then he'll have achieved that role model. You know? So for those of you who remember 1970, you may remember Mick Jagger looking something like this, but what he was doing, he was, remember, in the middle of the flower power hippie age. He was the first rock star to take his shirt off on stage. Everybody was kind of, you know, surprised. Today, he doesn't look much different. You know, in the 2020s, the Rolling Stones will still be going on their last world tour, I think. But I want to talk about this shirtless person, because there was also an American politician who did exactly the same thing in 1970. He became Mr. Universe. And a funny story about this, a few years ago, I was talking in California, and Arnold Schwarzenegger was on the program after me. And as I was putting up this chart, there were 500,000 people in the audience. He walked in the back of the room, you see, and this picture was up. And I walked in the door and he went like a, you know, had a big laugh, smile on his face and so on. And at the break between our two sessions, I said to him, you really like that photograph, don't you? He says, the interesting thing was I hadn't seen it for about 20 years, he said. That was the best part of my life, he said. He said, when I took my shirt off, the woman would come running. He says, you can't believe what it was like. And he says, it doesn't happen anymore. And I said to him, well, today women have better bodies than you ever had. And if you think about a photograph like this, it was unthinkable in 1970. We could never have imagined that women would do these kind of things. The role model was still very much the Miss World contest and so on. There were no books about women as CEOs. Clearly that doesn't happen in Monterey either. You have an all-male audience, but the point is that the role of women, for example, has changed so dramatically in that period of time. But now when we sit in the world as it is today, we think, well, that's the way the world is. What happens if there's another revolution like that? And when we talk in 2020, there won't be a single man in the audience. Is that possible? You see, the things in the future are very difficult to accept. What happened in the past, we all accept. So this is the challenge. And what I'm going to try and do is go through three things with you. I'm going to try and go through consumer culture, see how that's changed and how it might change. Technology, we're all familiar with that stuff. But just imagine how that's changed and how it might change. And then lastly, the structure of businesses, how you run businesses, has changed quite fundamentally as well, and how that might change in the future. And then when we've looked at sort of some scenarios for 2020, I'm going to ask you, are there any lessons we can learn from that future that you can apply in your business today? Because it's interesting. Imagine if we were standing now in 2020 and we were looking back to this day in 2008. I'm sure you would say, gee, I wish I'd known then, in 2008, what I know now, because I would have acted differently. Okay, so to us, the idea of learning from the future is really a leadership skill that has become absolutely essential in a world where everything is moving up and down like this. Okay, so not so important to learn from experience, but to learn from the future. And so those two skills you have to use together. And the big problem is, of course, the more experience we've got, the more we believe that that is what is right. And I'm also going to show you more that you have to start learning from our kids. Because it's interesting, our children see the world for what it is. We see the world for what it was, and or the way we want it to be. But kids are actually absolutely honest about what's going on in our world. So let's start with culture, and let's go back to 1969, 1970. Let's look at 1969. What happened in 1969 that most people on the planet remember? It's astonishing. Wherever you go in the world, this sort of image and the idea that that was a big thing in 1969 comes up. It doesn't matter whether you ask the question in China, in the Republic of Congo, or wherever you ask the question, it's the same answer. And if you ask people, why do you remember the moon landing? Many people will say, sorry?
Oh, no, sorry.
You don't remember it?
I was too young.
Me too. Most people will say, well, it was man's greatest technological achievement. I mean, it was spectacular. Imagine, you remember when Kennedy said we'll go to the moon? The guys in NASA said, what? Are you crazy? Are you out of your mind? You don't understand. And of course they did it in the end. But how many microprocessors were there in the Apollo space program? Well, none, because the microprocessor hadn't been invented yet. If you look at your kitchens, you may have a smoke detector in your kitchen. That smoke detector has more processing power than the entire Apollo space program. Or your watch. Now, can you imagine today going to the moon with that technology? I mean, they would think you were out of your mind. Yet, when we look at a computer or anything that has a microprocessor in it, we're not impressed anymore. We don't even think about it. The internet, it's there, mobile phones. So, to me, it's important that we remember where we've come from. Because when you think of the next 10 years, you're going to have the same kind of change, even if you're conservative, but perhaps more. There was also a photograph taken from the moon orbit. It was the first picture of the Earth. But we'd never seen this before. And remember that at this time, the Russians and the Americans were pointing nuclear weapons at each other, threatening to blow up the place. And when we saw this picture, we said, gee, look at that. There's no evidence of us. We hadn't made a mark on the planet. There's nothing you can see from the moon that we've created. Not the pyramids of Mexico, not the Chinese Great Wall, nothing. And here we're going to blow the place up. And the direct consequence of this photograph was that Greenpeace was created and every other environmental movement. This is where the environmental movement started, from one photograph. And it took 40 years for us to take it seriously. Now, there was also a war going on in Vietnam, massive war in Africa, millions of people were dying in Biafra and so on. The world didn't take much notice. The key thing about the Vietnam War, I think, in terms of culture and consumer culture, is that it was the first time in history that American students said to the government, excuse me, I'm not going to fight this war. The first reaction of the US government was to shoot them at Kent State and places like that. Remember, this is not long ago. But it was a change in attitudes of the youth. It was the same in Europe, because in Prague, the Russian tanks were rolling into Czechoslovakia. In Paris, the students were tearing up the streets, throwing cobbles at everybody. You had the same situation here. No, we're not getting this. Let's see if we can get there. We go. Remember just before the Olympics, the massacre? Now, again, it was about a youth revolution, and it happened all over the planet. Suddenly people were taking things into their own hands. And the characteristic of that was kind of exemplified in a music festival. Woodstock, anyone remember that? Now, to me, what's interesting is, leave the lights on. If you look at this, it kind of crystallized the thinking of young people. It was about peace, love, get rid of war, get rid of government, all of these things. And of course you had exactly the same kind of festival here in Mexico in 71. Now I believe one of the consequences of that was in fact that rock music was banned for quite a long time. And I think you told me it was Rod Stewart. It was in the 80s probably, yeah?
Right.
That sort of changed all of that. But as you look at this, remember, what this was doing was creating a revolution and started a whole lot of things that we take very much for granted today. You know, Martin Luther King was assassinated in '68, so by 70, the civil rights movement was right up there in the United States. If you look at any of the women's rights websites, they all tell you that it started in 1970. So we call this the start of the culture of the individual. So there was globally, suddenly individuals became more important than business, than government, and the power that individuals took was amazing. There were two countries that were excluded from this: China and the Soviet Union. Okay, totalitarian coverage of all this. The rest of the world kind of just got into the spirit, and suddenly, we started thinking differently. The people who grew up in this period are called baby boomers. Now, I'm a baby boomer, very much so. My daughter tells me that all the time. But, the term baby boom was first coined because there was this explosion of babies after the Second World War. But I read that baby boom term a little bit differently, because we were also born into an economic boom that the world had never seen. So when the world economy is doing this, you can do anything and make money. So Bill Gates was a typical baby boomer. He told his dad, I don't want to do what you did. I don't even want to go to university. Dad said, no, but you've got to go, you've got to go, you've got to go. And eventually he went to Harvard and dropped out in the middle of the year. He's decided now he wanted to start a business. He came to us at IBM. I was still working at IBM at those days. And he said, you guys at IBM, you need an operating system on your PC. And we said, yes, we do. Ours is really crap. And he said, I got this operating system. And we said, thought he was so good. I mean, he dressed funny. He had jeans and a t-shirt, I mean, we were wearing serious suits like you guys. And so anyway, we offered him a job. We said, Bill, you can be vice president of personal computer software. And he laughed at us. You can't believe how this guy in jeans and a t-shirt laughed at us. Here we're offering one of the best jobs in IBM, and he laughed. He said, no, you don't understand IBM. I want to start a business and make it bigger than IBM. And then we laughed. We couldn't believe how silly this boy was. Because, you must realize that, at the time we were giving away software for free. And he wanted to sell it. He didn't understand clearly. At that stage, actually, IBM was offered 49% share in Microsoft. Our accountants turned it down because they said Microsoft has no assets. I remember the term. They said their assets get in their cars and drive home every evening. He says, we don't know how to manage this. That 49% would be worth more than IBM today. Can you see how when these step changes happen, we don't know how to react because the old rules just don't work anymore. And what I realized very quickly was that I was very different to my father. He was born into the space between the two world wars, and he never knew what an economic boom was. To him, a good economy was an economy that was stable. So stability was everything. To me, I was impatient. I wanted growth every year. And because the world was doing this, it was easy. Okay? And I discovered also that I was very different to my daughter. She was this, Generation X, as they are called. Remember, the X is for the algebraic unknown. This is why it was called Generation X. We don't understand these kids. And I discovered that I don't understand my daughter. I mean, she's 28 now. She works in San Francisco, but she was 13. I don't know, something happened to me. I thought I must act like a father, and I must tell her she's now a teenager and there's all these dangerous things in the world and all the rest. So the first thing I discovered was that it was very difficult to get into my daughter's diary. At 13, she was busy. And if my job title, father, probably put her off as well, But eventually I managed to get into a diary, and we went to a burger place, and I thought I must tell her about, the meaning of life and all this sort of stuff. I'm sure many of you have gone through that as well. Anyway, we sat down, we ordered whatever we had to order, and I was ready. I had this PowerPoint presentation in my head. It must have been at least 47 slides. I was well rehearsed. I'd spent months on this. And as I was about to start, my daughter looked up at me and she said, Dad, may I just say one thing? I said, of course, darling, anything you want. And she said to me, Dad, there is nothing that you can teach me about relationships. Now, she must have seen the blood drain from my face, I must have looked like death. And she looked at me and she said, Dad, it's not about you. I love you. Your daughter looks at you in the eye and says, I love you. Anything is possible. She says, Dad, it's not about you. It's about your generation. She says, in my class at school, not even half of us live with both parents. And you guys want to preach to us about how to live our lives. She said, by accident, we will do better. I was now fast forwarding to slide 47, because what else could I say?
Thank you.
But you've got to understand that this generation in the Western world is the first generation that has not experienced family life like we kind of imagined it. Big, big shift. And then she said to me, Dad, by the way, you also screwed up the environment. So, then luckily the food arrived and everything was okay again. But to me, if you look at what these generations did, is they all created different businesses. So, General Motors, IBM, HSBC, all of the big traditional sort of world-class companies were created with the silent generation mentality. So it was very much control-oriented, hierarchical. The orders came from the top, went down and were executed. If you didn't obey them, you were out. You basically stayed there by obeying, doing as you're told. The baby boomers came along and created slightly different companies. Microsoft for many years was the good example. And if you were a young person, 25, 30 years old, really bright, in the 1980s and 1990s, you wanted to go and work for Microsoft. Because it was the place where That was cool, you know. You had some control. You didn't have to wear what they told you to. There were no working hours. You just had to deliver the goods. But today, the brightest 25-year-olds, the last place they want to go and work is at Microsoft. Microsoft cannot attract those people anymore. Nor can IBM, General Motors, or HSBC or whatever. Those people want to go and work for something different. The best example probably is Google, but if you're in Asia, then it's a company like Alibaba, or Skype, for example, is another one that attracts all the best technical brains. Now, just to give you an example of the scale of this problem, Google attracts 200,000 new job applications every month without advertising. IBM spends more than $20 million a year on recruitment advertising, and at the end of all that, the people they attract are about half as good as the ones that Google attract for free. This is an important point, because what we're experiencing here is a whole new set of values and new attitudes. Because I'm sure most of your companies as well, you want to attract the brightest young people, don't you? So what do you need? A better advertising program? See, if IBM asked me this question, I'd say you don't need a better advertising program. You need a new company. A company with new attitudes and new values, because that will automatically attract them, then you don't have to advertise. And this is something that's very different about the world that we live in. To get the best people, to get the best customers, if you have to advertise, then there's something wrong. And I'll show you some examples of this in a moment. But can you see how odd this seems to us? Because we've grown up in a world where if you want to tell people about your products, you advertise. Now suddenly it's something else. And the example I'd like to show you is from Microsoft, when they decided to go into the computer games business. Remember in the late 90s, it became obvious that computer games were a big industry, because suddenly they were bigger than Hollywood. And there were only 3 players in the computer games industry. Microsoft thought, gee, we need a new kicker in our revenues, so let's go for this thing they call the Xbox. The big problem with that was that the Microsoft marketplace was primarily baby boomers. Big corporates, the CIOs of big corporates and so on, were baby boomers. And the Microsoft brand at that stage was the second most visible brand in the world after Coca-Cola. So, they had to do something different, and they had to attract Generation X and Generation Y, or the millennials, or whatever. So this is the ad that they put together to launch Xbox. This was the European version. So just watch this for a moment. A couple of things about the ad. How do you feel about it? A little bit shocked?
Terrorized.
Sorry?
Terrorized.
Terrorized. Now, it's fascinating because this ad was banned after 1 week of British television. And who was it banned by, do you think? Well, the baby boomers and the silent generation who didn't think their kids should be exposed to this. Which of course gave it instant credibility with the younger people. It was downloaded 3 million times off the Microsoft website in the first month. Now, a couple of things about the ad though. First of all, what does this ad say about the product? Does it tell you anything about what this new product is? Absolutely nothing. I don't know, I'm sure you also remember days when, when Black & Decker advertised a new drill, they actually told you it was for making holes, that it had a thing that went around 30,000 times a second, and it had an impact thing of so many. There was lots of stuff about what the product did. And the world that we live in today, once you appeal to an individual, they are smart enough to go and find out what it is. We never had that option. So it was a different level of communication. The other thing that's interesting to me is that if you look back at products, say in the 60s and 70s, there were always good products and there were bad products. For example, my dad always said to me, when you buy your first car, you must be careful, you must buy a good car. What he meant was don't buy a British car, because he knew that the British car would fail at least in the first week, Do you know that doesn't happen anymore? You can buy a car from a Korean manufacturer, a name you've never heard of before, and that car is going to live longer than you will. So quality has become a commodity. So you cannot tell people what a product does anymore because everything does the same. And it's the same whether it's an auditing service from Deloitte or a financial service from HSBC or a car, they all do exactly the same thing. And they do it at a very high level. Perfect quality, 24 hours availability, all the rest is the entry point. Then you have to differentiate yourself. And that's what Microsoft are doing here. It's something else. If you believe this, you'll love our product. And you'll find out what it is. You see the different attitude. The other thing that's of course startling about this is that they dropped the Microsoft brand completely. Yeah? So, to me, that is still something that is absolutely alien to most banks, for example. So I can't imagine HSBC starting a new service and not using the HSBC brand. But that is what you have to do when you cross generations. So to me, this is a big, 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 big shift. So the culture of consumers is changing because of the environment that we live in. And also, if you want to attract the best people, then you have to create a business that attracts the best people, not a better advertising campaign. And that to me is one of the most difficult things that we work with in terms of companies. Let's have a quick look at technology as well. I mean, back in the 60s, you had this sort of stuff being advertised, transistor radios, for example. You find them now in antique shops. But the transistor radio had a massive effect because of the transistor radio and the fact that kids could listen to their own kind of music. It created the music industry. Without the transistor radio, there would have been no music industry. Because the music industry was tiny until we had this device that allowed people to listen to many different kinds of music. And in 1970, there were about 1,000 companies that we could identify that were in transistor radios in one way or another. And only 2 of those survive today. 2 of 1,000. And I'm sure you know those names as well. Philips and Sony, yeah. Now you'd think that a company that was so successful in consumer electronics and in music and all the rest, that rode this tsunami of the transistor radio for so many years, produced products like the Walkman and all the others, would notice the next big revolution, which was downloaded music. And both those companies totally missed the downloaded music revolution. Just didn't get it. Now, think about it. How can that possibly happen? Let me give you an example. In around, it was the late 90s, early 2000s, when a new format was invented called MP3. Now, MP3 is just a way of encoding music, so it takes up very little space. And that enabled people to download music from the internet. Remember, those days the internet speeds were very slow, so it used to take an hour, I think it was, to download one tune. Then MP3 comes along and it took a few minutes. Fantastic. And in Sony, who were clients of ours in those days, every month they had an innovation meeting. And in one of these meetings, an engineer came along and he kind of held up a device which was about that size, a bit thicker than a business card. And he said, this is the new Walkman. Everybody said, oh, this is very small, very thin. What have you got there? No, this is a solid state Walkman. Remember the Walkman used to have gears and pulleys and all sorts of stuff to pull tape around and so on. And he said, no, we've integrated all of that into this little device. And somebody from Sony Music said, well, where does the music come from? No tape. No, you download it from the internet using this format called MP3. So everybody's very impressed. They passed it around the room. And then the Walkman product manager stood up and he was very cross. He said, I just worked out that this device we can make so cheaply. And the guy was presenting and said, yes, we can build this at $5 a pop. Eventually, and when we get to mass production, $5 is all it will take to manufacture this. And the guy said, but you can't come here with that kind of a business plan, because you realize for every one of these we sell, and we don't sell a Walkman, we cut our profit by 75%. And then he got really cross and he said, Mr. Chairman, we have to stop these engineers coming into these meetings with these crazy ideas unless they have a business plan that we've gone through. The guy from Sony Music stood up and he said, look, this is dangerous. This will encourage downloaded music and piracy like we've never seen. This guy was kicked out of the meeting. And what he was holding in his hand was the iPod. And of course it took a few years after that for Apple to launch it. And Sony missed it completely. So did Philips. The lesson we learned from this is an important one, because it happens in all businesses, is that you have to learn to eat yourself before somebody else does. And technology has this effect more and more and more and more. And I'll give you some more examples. In other words, if you don't do this to yourself, we're talking about paint, we're in the paint business. Imagine if somebody sells you something that you paint onto the wall, but you can program it with software. So you can say today it's going to be brown, tomorrow orange, then green. Or maybe all at once with a picture of the New York skyline on it. Impossible? It already exists. It's just very expensive. So can you see the problem here is that if something threatens your business, do you embrace it and launch it and kill your old business, start the new, or do you defend against it? And you know what's happened with Sony in the last few years. And it's this problem of market leaders. If you look at this whole world of music, movies, and so on, there's some wonderful examples in all of this. And you can kind of see that if you look at compact discs and DVDs and all these things, that probably when we get to 2020, everything will be downloaded. It's just the cost doesn't work for a physical product. Now you're talking 10, 15 times as expensive as for the downloaded version. And consumers actually eventually stop paying 10 times the price. Especially if they get younger and younger and younger and have never known these things to be of any value. So you can kind of see it's going to be all downloaded. Do you agree with that? Now, the problem is that most of the music companies still fight against this. Yeah, they won't embrace it because they've got too much to lose. So what happens is other industries build up in parallel. You know that last year, more than 30 billion tunes were downloaded illegally. 30 billion. And you know, in a democracy, governments do what people want. And remember, this will change the laws of copyright and all the rest. So to me, it's always interesting how these things are absolutely unsustainable because of a few things that happen in technology. And technology has been around for a long time. In the 60s, you had all those things. Today, you've still got thousands of TV channels, all these things. And now, you've got a telephone marketplace that is absolutely mind-boggling. And there are only 6.5 billion people on the planet. And last year, 1 billion mobile phones were sold. I mean, just think about that. Now, what's it going to be next year? 2 billion? Or is the market saturated? What happens next is not just an extrapolation of the past. Something is going to change. And there's a clue when I saw this little news flash from the mayor of San Francisco. This was 2.5 years ago. He actually came up and he said, what we're going to do is we're going to give everybody who lives and works in San Francisco free mobile broadband internet. So wherever you are, you can connect to anybody else on the planet, do your business or whatever, for free. Now, do you think that's good for San Francisco? Has Monterey done this yet? Should Monterey do it? Would it make Monterey more attractive? Would it release a lot more economic activity? I think so. But who do you think hates this? All the mobile phone companies, because you're saying, hey, this infrastructure is going to become free. We call this the socialism of technology. In other words, as technology gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and more prolific, it becomes, like a basic human right, and government provides it. Now, we did one of these weekly publications, now my bullet series, about 3 years ago. And we said, imagine if this happened, that the Swedish government and the South African government say that personal communications is a basic human right. Like healthcare, food, shelter, all of these things, the ability to communicate with everybody on the planet all the time is a basic human right. And therefore, the government is going to provide it. And in fact, in this example, the South African government provided you with a new mobile phone every year for free, and all the infrastructure was free. Do you think it's a good thing? It's probably the cheapest investment to drive the economy that a government could make. Imagine if the Mexican government did this, how many more people would suddenly get involved in the economy? Of course, there are a lot of people who hate this idea, and especially if we started to include banking. Now, if you say banking is a basic human right, the ability to manage your money. So the government provides free banking via the mobile phone that you get for free, so that everybody can manage their money. Now, to me, as a banker, I could react one of two ways. I could say, this is the worst thing I've ever heard. Or I can say, well, I don't make much money out of the infrastructure anyway, but if everybody's connected, boy, can I start adding some value and making some money out of that. So you can see that the shift in thinking is a very important one. Because what's being commoditized here is actually the stuff that nobody's making any money out of. We had a discussion with, excuse me, with Vodafone in the UK, they're Europe's biggest mobile phone company, and they said, gee, but this is interesting because we would have to change our business quite dramatically, but it runs right into our strategic thinking. And they told me something which I hadn't realized, is that they say that their competitors today can put in a Wi-Fi hotspot at 1% of the cost that they paid 10 years ago. So when they built their infrastructure, they paid 100. A new player coming into the market today pays 1. So infrastructure you don't actually want to be in. So why not give it to government? Okay? And so can you see this thinking changes the way we view the world. The other thing it would do, it would increase the number of people participating in social networks. And if you look at MySpace, YouTube, Facebook, all of these things, those communities are now bigger than countries, much bigger. The amount of communication that the people using those have is enormous. I don't know if you know this, but your kids have 30 times the number of relationships that you had at that age. And they manage them all the time. And of course you're going to tell me they're not real relationships because they're in Second Life or wherever. But they are developing a skill for the future that we will never have. And those consumer markets are going to behave completely differently, and you're going to have to behave in them differently. It will change TV channels, newspapers, magazines, radio stations, all of those things to a degree which is unthinkable. So as technology becomes socialized, this changes everything. We believe one of the biggest consequences of this way of looking at the universe will be that consumer appliances will disappear completely. Because remember, they started in the 60s. Everybody started getting, washing machine and a radiogram and all these kind of things. And then we got more and more and more of them, and now we reckon they're going to disappear. Am I being serious? Well, let me give you a few examples. Has anybody bought an answering machine in the last few years? I mean, you've got to be crazy. Why would you want to do that? And what happened to the answering machine industry is that wasn't somebody came along with a better answering machine. It was replaced by a service that you got for free with your mobile phone. And suddenly you couldn't sell another answering machine. So can you see the step change? Oof, it's like running into a wall. The only business strategy was to have sold the business 2 years ago. There is nothing you can do with that at that point. Think about the sort of television and PC comparison. I mean, when you travel on business, do you ever take a television set with you? Why is that such a stupid idea? Because wherever you go, there's a television set. But who travels with a BlackBerry or a laptop computer? We will say, yeah, of course, how could I not? 5 years from now, if I say, do you travel with a laptop computer, you're going to laugh at me. You're going to say, what do you think, I'm crazy? Because wherever I go, I can get connected. It takes my voice, a fingerprint, whatever, and I'm connected. Now, we can kind of see that coming, but who do you think reacts negatively against that idea? Are the people who make laptop computers and all of these things. They say, no, it'll never happen. But it goes much further than that. Because if you look at your home, for example, and the way you do laundry, I mean, you're probably used to the fact that there's a thing called a washing machine. Let me take you now 20 years into the future. First of all, imagine yourself 20 years older. Just add that on, okay? You're now sitting in a rocking chair, probably on the beach at Cozumel somewhere. You've got a grandchild on your knee who's jumping up and down and saying, Granddad, Mommy's just told me something about you that I don't believe. She says that back in the year 2000, when you were young, that you used to wash your clothes by boiling them in a big white box that you had in the home. And it had a window in it like television. You could watch your clothes going round. And that you put blue gooky chemicals into this, chemicals 20 years from now, chemicals. And then Mommy says that sometimes this machine got so excited that it would walk around the house. And she says, when the weather was good, you hung your clothes outside. Granddad, tell me that's not true. What's the matter with this kid? Well, he's never seen a washing machine. When he's been told that when you finish with your clothes, you hang them up in a wardrobe. That's a big step for a 13-year-old, And then what happens? You close the door. When you open the door again, the clothes are clean and pressed. Now, what happened in the wardrobe? Well, in 2012, Sony announced a product which was tiny, like a postage stamp, weighs 5 grams, and you stick it to the inside of your wardrobe, and when the door's closed, it emits ultrasound, shakes all the dirt and grime out of the clothes, and because the clothes are then made out of a smart fiber that remembers the shape it was when they were new, the clothes just restore themselves to their new shape. Now, here's the dilemma. First of all, do you want one? And every woman in every audience I've ever talked to says, yes, please, now. But imagine the problem of the washing machine manufacturer, Hoover or whoever, who've just spent $25 billion in China and Eastern Europe putting their new plants up there. How do they compete against this tiny device made using nanotechnology, which weighs 5 grams? You can imagine what it costs compared to the steel and plastic and glass and everything that goes into a washing machine. Price differential, 100 to 1. You see that this is a step change. And all that has to happen, because the technology exists today, is that Gap and other stores have to start selling clothes made out of smart fibers. And it has to become fashionable, of course. Once it's fashionable, these little devices will come along. And guess what? They'll be free. You'll get them free in Cosmopolitan magazine. It will be one of these peel-off things. Somebody will give them away for nothing. So you can see here that these step changes are very often driven by a technology that absolutely stops you being competitive. In other words, if you're an existing player in an existing industry, you cannot compete. You should have sold your business 2 years ago. So those are things that we really look at and worry about quite a lot. If you look at these sort of devices, I mean, we all know that today a mobile phone has got as much power as a laptop had. We look at things like the iPhone and we think, gee, that's really sexy, you know, everybody wants one. There's now the Google phone, announced a few weeks ago. Now, I must tell you, with Google's capacity to sell stuff without advertising, I'm sure that 80% of mobile phone sales within a year will be this. Because they give you something else. They give you a phone that doesn't need an operating system, that just has a browser that runs all applications. So it's a whole new way of looking at technology. But by the 2020s, all of these sexy devices will have disappeared, and they will have disappeared onto a tiny little chip that this ant is holding up, about the size of a grain of sand, built using nanotechnology, and it has a power much greater than any chip that's in a laptop today. Now, what do you do with a tiny little microprocessor the size of a grain of sand? Well, you certainly don't build a big keyboard around it. You put it under your skin. And once it's under your skin, let's assume you have it in your wrist, and the year's 2020, and I send you an email message, you will really get it. And how will you know it's there? Well, it'll ring you, you know. And then what do? Well, most people will say, I'll have my secretary print it out. Okay, no. Remember that once it's in there, it's very close to your nervous system. Your nervous system processes the same signals that the microprocessor does, and all I have to do is get that message to your visual cortex, not to your eyes, remember they're useless input devices, straight to the visual cortex, so that you can read your emails just by thinking about them. Does that make you feel a little like this? A little technophobic? Well, to me, this sounds scary, but it's already available in 2008. There are already 8 scientists in Britain who are wired up like this. They can send emails simply by thinking about them. So, if I send you an email, a video clip, or whatever, in 2020, you'll just get a funny look in your eyes. Maybe sitting down to dinner with your wife, she will think that you've fallen in love or something, and you're just watching your latest corporate video, you know? I want to tell you that this is already here. This nightclub in Barcelona implants chips at the door. This 18-year-old girl can only get access to the VIP areas of this nightclub by having a chip implanted in her arm, and with that chip, it identifies her and it allows her to pay for goods and services without a credit card and without money. This is today. You see, the problem is that you will never like this idea, and your kids will never know a world without it. And they do this not because they love the technology, but it's a cool thing to do, to be able to get into the VIP areas of this particular nightclub. Can you see the challenge here? And let me give you a few more examples that will also challenge your thinking. This dress wasn't manufactured. The cotton wasn't grown, it wasn't harvested, it wasn't woven, it wasn't put together in some sweatshop in Shenzhen in China. This dress was printed. And it was printed on something you all know called an inkjet printer, except that this is a 3-dimensional inkjet printer. Same technology that you print photographs with, except it does it in a 3rd dimension, that's up. So all you do is send to that printer the digital blueprint of the dress, and it's still a very slow technology, I must tell you. It takes 30 minutes to print this dress. The other big disadvantage is the printer costs $40,000 US. So not every home is going to have one. But by 2015, the cost is estimated to be about about $40. So think about this. 2016, it'll be free. As long as you buy the cartridges for wool, cotton, all the other things that you want to print. And wouldn't it be nice just to be able to print a spare part for your car, or for your wife to print a pair of shoes? Go onto the Blarney website and choose the shoes and just print them out. How about at 5% of the cost? Because at 5% of the cost, the designer makes 3 times as much as they do currently. Because remember what you've done here. You've connected the designer directly with the consumer, and everything else in between has disappeared. So in this case, the cotton wasn't grown, there's no farming, there's no harvesting, there's no transport of the stuff to a factory. The factory doesn't produce anything anymore. The logistics services to take it to a retail store don't exist anymore. The retail store doesn't exist anymore, nor does the consumer have to drive to the retail store. You think this has some impact? You reckon? Well, we call this the future of manufacturing. We're saying that manufacturing is going to be printing. Certainly for a lot of stuff. We thought it was going to start happening in 2012. We published this 3 or 4 years ago. We're wrong. It's going to happen in 2020. The first product like this is going to come out in 2010. The latest space shuttle flight had one of these on it. Because remember, when you're up in the space shuttle, the last thing you have is spare parts. If anything goes wrong, you're in deep trouble. What they took with them this time was a CD-ROM with all the parts information, and a printer like this that could print 2 metals and 2 plastics. So as long as you could print the spare part, that whatever was broken, you could print with that, they could make it on the spot. Last year, a mobile phone was printed like this for the first time, including display, keyboard, with the wiring inside it, the microprocessor, everything was printed on one of these printers. So if you're in the retail business, for example, this should be really worrying too. In other words, you can print your next mobile phone at home, if the date is 2015 and beyond. This to me is one of those revolutionary technologies that should really scare us, because it's going to change the whole basis of economic thinking. And watch this video.
Inside your body.
In what you might call the laboratory of the future, Dr. Anthony Atala is manufacturing body parts.
Actually, here you see an engineered blood vessel. You can actually see the vessel beating.
From blood vessels to muscle tissue, Atala and his team at Wake Forest University believe, in theory, anything inside the body can be grown outside the body. They've made 18 different types of tissue so far.
That's a heart valve. This is an engineered heart valve.
A pulsing heart valve to be transplanted into a sheep.
When people ask me, what do? We grow tissues and organs.
You really are making body parts.
We are making body parts that we can implant right back into patients.
Once considered a Frankenstein fantasy, the field of regenerative medicine is on the verge of unimagined breakthroughs. Scientists believe every part of the body has cells capable of regeneration. All researchers need to do is isolate those cells and coax them to grow.
You're using heart cells in an inkjet printer.
Yes. In this lab, they're making the heart of a mouse. A heart they grew layer by layer by spraying the cells with a printer.
I can guarantee you the breakfast was not made like that. but it will be. Can you see how this changes your paradigms of what is possible with the technology that you currently have in your home or in your office? This is exactly the same technology with a third dimension added to it. And now you're buying print cartridges with heart cells in them. Can you see the problem here? If you apply this to the world at large, to consumer items, to retailing, to manufacturing, to logistics, all of these industries will be transformed by this. And to me, at the heart of this revolution is this thing called technology. The degree to which we're doing this is absolutely astonishing. Finally, just a few words about business models, because to me, the way we do business is changing dramatically. You know, if you're a successful business, you probably have a going rate. In other words, there's a rate at which you have been growing, and your shareholders expect you to continue that. Isn't that so? Now, what I've been talking to you about are all these market forces that could change that. For a successful business, these market forces are most often thought to be negative because they threaten your business, okay? So if you do nothing, your business will decline. So we get very innovative and we do what we call evolutionary innovation. In other words, the more this pressure it builds here, the more innovative you become, because what you want to do is to continue that going rate. Now, we're addicted to growth. We are. Now, the point about this is that this is what we call the business of today. And in your business of today, it's very difficult to see these market forces in a positive way. Yet anybody who's not in your business, like I'm not in the paint business, and this new coating comes out that's very high-tech, nano fibers or whatever, I think, gee, this is a big opportunity. So what we're increasingly doing with our clients is to say, let us look at all market forces in a positive sense, as well as understanding obviously the downside, and let us create some new businesses that create this quantum growth on top of that. We call that radical innovation, and we call that, in another sense, your business of tomorrow. And to me, the interesting thing about this is that in every business, in fact, you should be doing both. Do you agree? You must obviously protect your cash cow, but you've also got to ride these new waves. And that's what Sony has not been able to do the last 5 or 6 years, and they're trying to turn that around. But many companies, I think, need to do both. The leadership and management skills you need for both are very different. And it comes down to answering this question. In other words, what is your appetite for growth? If you're like my father, he wanted stability. The baby boomers said, no, we've got to have constant growth. And if growth is an issue for your future, then you have to do this kind of stuff, because this is where the new growth is going to come up. These are the step changes that we talked about. And you must remember that growth had a very bad kind of reputation back in the 70s. Because remember, we had all the oil crises. We thought the world was going to run out of oil. In fact, Harvard did a study in 1970 where they said the world was going to run out of oil by the year 2000. It's a very serious study. And they said that the US had better not increase their use of oil. Well, the US has doubled their consumption of oil since then, and we haven't run out. And the reason is very simple. When entrepreneurs see the word scarcity, they create new businesses. Like, it's to make the thing plentiful. And the whole commodity cycle that we see in charts like this, what you see here is commodity prices over the last 150 years. And you can see here, since the First World War, commodity prices on average have dropped significantly. In fact, by 84% in real terms. And that includes oil and gas and commodities such as maize and so on. So this is what economists sometimes call a falling price boom. In other words, as prices of commodities fall, so more and more of that commodity is used. The prices then fall even more. But what happens to profit margins in a falling price boom is quite scary, because the more you sell, the smaller your profit margin becomes. So this is the phenomenon that we're in. The big difference today, and I've tried to show you that, is that today everything is being commoditized, not just commodities. Every product and service. Now, I don't care whether it's a car or paint or a banking service or an audit service or whatever. Everybody offers the same high quality, high everything product and service. So everything is going through a falling price boom. And who's to blame for this? Well, one thing and one thing alone. That's the stuff called technology. Somebody told me I mustn't use these in Mexico. But what's happened is over the last 30, 40 years, we have used technology everywhere. And every time we do that, we cut the cost of doing anything. And as we use more and more technology, we think this phenomenon will increase. Some big questions now. Who will be the new leaders in your industry or in the world? Will be those companies and those countries that can thrive on falling prices. So Germany, for example, to me, has a real problem because they always try to sell you a car that is more and more and more expensive. Very technically good and so on. The trouble is the rest of the world is going for falling prices, so doing more and more with less and less. Okay, so this is an important change. The other question that always comes up here is, what about jobs? Because surely the more technology you throw at this thing, the more jobs, or the fewer jobs you need, the more jobs are lost. And that's absolutely true. So the only way you can keep unemployment from rising is to actually grow your economy and create new kinds of jobs. And that's a real challenge, because how much can you grow? I don't know if you know this, but in China, for example, China has to have economic growth of 7% a year just to support the new jobs coming into the economy. So once China drops below that 7% growth number, which it will do within 12 months, to us 7% growth a year is great for a country. For China, it's a disaster. Now, you have to ask yourself, what about China? Because China is not a high-tech economy, is it? It's low wage, sort of menial stuff that you don't want to do in Mexico anymore, they do in China. Well, guess what? This is what's going to happen to China. They're going to do what the West did. In the next 10 years, they will do what the West did in the last 50. Because China turns out 300,000 engineers a year. What do 300,000 young engineers every year do? They do high-tech stuff. And China, 10 years from now, is going to be a high-tech, high-value, high-wage economy, rather than the kind of economy we see today. And the impact of that will be massive job losses. So as China automates its factories, all those jobs will disappear. And their farms are on average size of only 1.2 acres. This is a fourth world country in terms of farming. As China starts consolidating those, hundreds of millions of people will lose their work. This is a phenomenon that we really don't understand yet. But this is all driven by economic transformation by technology. And if you look at the nature of jobs, they have changed as well. In the 70s, almost all the new jobs were being created by corporates. Now we realize in the last 30 years, most of the new jobs have actually been created by small enterprises, by individuals working on their own. But still, more people work for corporations today than ever before. In the next 30 years, it's going to change. For the first time in history, corporates will employ fewer people than they do today. So this has never happened before. This decline in corporate jobs worldwide. Let me give you an example. IBM in 1970 employed 500,000 people. Today, IBM employs almost half of that. It's half the size in terms of number of people and 10 times the size in terms of business volumes. But today, IBM is a network of more than 55,000 separate businesses, only 2 of which are owned by IBM. The other 55,000 make up this new growth in jobs that we kind of see happening in the future. We call this a fractal world, that corporations are becoming fragmented, broken apart. And the one thing you have to say about corporations like that is that you can't lead a company that is composed of 55,000 different companies the same way that you did a hierarchy. It's something we learned at IBM very early on. Because everyone that sells your product also sells all of your competitors' products. And if they decide not to sell your product anymore, you won't even know about it. So it becomes much more important that you manage the relationships with these 55,000 business partners. And we don't have those skills. Our kids are learning those skills because they have 30 times the number of relationships. It's interesting how we moved from the differentiators being great products, quality products and great people. Today, it's the services that they wrap around that, our ability to manage information about the marketplace and relationships that become the competitors in this very networked world. I've given you the example of IBM. Another interesting example is the largest trading company in Asia, a company called Li & Fung. They make almost all the products for Disney and a lot of companies like that. But they have 9,000 people worldwide, Li & Fung, which is not big. They're distributed around 20 countries, but they have 45,000 business partners that they manage. Now let me tell you, that's a different kind of leadership skill to anything that you've seen before. And every company is going to go through this transformation. From a centrally controlled business where you do everything yourself, to a totally fragmented network business where you depend entirely on the quality of your relationships. Very, very different. The other thing, of course, that's happening is that everyone is connected in your marketplace, and they're talking about your business in a very different way. So HSBC, for example, discovered last year when they changed their student loan programs in the UK. Within one day, 5,000 students had got together on Facebook and told HSBC how they hated this new thing. Within 24 hours, HSBC changed the rules again. So the power of individuals, the power of consumers, especially the younger generation, is changing the way they talk about you, about your products, and all the rest. And you can't avoid that anymore. It's a much more open, transparent world than ever before. What will differentiate companies is very different. First of all, knowledge in a knowledge economy is the commodity. So what we can say now about knowledge is it's worthless. Because anybody can have the knowledge that you have. So it's the ability to use that knowledge that becomes the differentiator. And it's what you do with what you know. So don't hire smart people, hire smart people who can apply that knowledge. And that's a very different thing. In a world where things change like they do today, experience becomes less and less valuable. And the attitude to unlearning becomes a differentiator. Remember that in a hierarchy, there are lots of management jobs. In a network, there are very few. The only job that we see growing in terms of management jobs are project management jobs, where you have project managers that can manage large projects where the people don't work for them. Okay, so the people are all independent, but they're all united by something else, not top-down control. We see this extensively in the construction industry and almost every other industry as well. Remember that in a network there are very few management jobs, but you only maintain your role in a network if you exhibit leadership characteristics. And finally, the thing that we've realized more and more is that in a hierarchy, people are your most important asset. In a network, relationships are your most important asset. So the biggest leadership and management skill that we see being valuable in the future is to manage relationships. And that's exactly where our kids have the edge. And it's something we still don't fully understand. What I've tried to describe for you is a world in which individuals and businesses are much more smart and much more interconnected. And I hope you see that this is a world of unbelievable opportunity, provided you see them as such. But because they are new opportunities, you can't get there just by working harder. And these are the step changes. You have to work differently, look differently at it, and that's what we've been focusing on. And it's really, to put it simply, it's about choosing your future. Now, don't just project what you are today. Choose a future that is relevant, that is giving you those new growth opportunities. So I hope that as we've gone through here, I've hit some of those hotspots. So I want you just to sit back for 3 minutes, listen to some music, some old baby boomer music, and see if there are any lessons we can learn from this future that we can apply to our business today. So just sit back for a few moments.
Shame. Oh, Ansel, así es, para cualquier pregunta, duda o inquietud que seguramente pueda surgir de toda la perspectiva que nos compartió Wolfgang. Entonces, no sé si hay alguna pregunta, alguna duda, algún reto, vaya, a un poco de los pensamientos que nos acaba de compartir, por favor.
I will do just a commentary. Yesterday I was hearing a professor of Harvard, you might know, Prahalad,
Prahalad, yes, very well.
Indian, and he was saying about those 4,000 million people that live in the very poverty line in the world, that nobody looks at them. And he was giving us about 10 or 15 examples of things that are radically changing their lives, like prosthetics. They're saying a prosthetic leg in the States would cost $30,000, and if you made it for something like $30 or $50. The value of mobile phone time normally costs about 10 cents here, and in India it is costing 0.4 cents. So it's about 20 or 50 times less, and they're rich. And the model, the business model, are making money.
Sure.
They're making more money at 10 or 20 times less the price, and reaching a lot of volume, a lot of population. And he showed actually a video of an Indian using this prosthetic gear that were made in factories with very artisanal labor, and he was climbing a tree with a prosthetic leg and jumping down and running 100 meters back and forth, and with a $50 price prosthetic. So I feel that there's something there in the future of those 4,000 million.
He calls this the economy at the bottom of the pyramid. He says because Mexico is the same. You've got a large chunk of the population that is really at the bottom of the pyramid. And you might say very easily when you look at this, well, they excluded from this. This is a high-tech thing. But I think that's dead wrong, because the benefit to the bottom of the pyramid is far greater than to you and me. We're privileged already. The impact of a mobile phone on us is small. The impact of a mobile phone on somebody who doesn't have an address and a job is profound, because they suddenly can become economically active. We do a lot of work in South Africa, for example. There's a classical example of that. When the mobile phone network started there, they made a forecast that the market for mobile phones was 1 million mobile phones. The population's 47 million. Okay? They said the market was this was in 1990. 1 million. The mobile phones there now are 36 million mobile phones. And of course they got it all wrong because they thought that people couldn't afford this. Okay? People will pay for this because it changes their life. And so, the Prahalad examples are absolutely profound. The other thing that's important is in Soweto, this famous suburb of Johannesburg, where all these riots took place, that Nelson Mandela grew up in and so on. I was speaking to the guys at McDonald's, and I said to them, who are your biggest competitors? You'd be surprised that mobile phone companies are now regarded by McDonald's as their biggest competitor, because kids will rather make a phone call than eat a meal. Oh, but it's not about making a phone call, it's also about creating a little video clip for their friends to tell them this is where I am today. So, that point, I haven't really discussed it, but if you look at the economy of Mexico, say, all of this stuff has profound implications on the bottom half of the pyramid. And Unilever, for example, in India, very interestingly, when you buy washing powder in Mexico, I'm sure it comes in big boxes. Yes?
Bags.
Plastic bags. In India now, they have got a whole new distribution system for little quantities like this. Because at the bottom of the pyramid, you can't sell them a big thing like this. They've got nowhere to keep it. They can't afford the amount of money and so on. So the way you look at markets changes. It becomes much more fractal. This word fractal, fragmented. But you have to apply that same thinking to your business as well. Because the fact that everybody can be connected means that they can be more disconnected. But it has all sorts of new implications. I don't know how we're doing time-wise, but maybe we'll take one or two more questions, haven't we?
Yes, I guess a couple of more questions.
Anybody else? When we have some more time together, I'll tell you about some of the stuff that's not available yet.
Is there a relationship between hindsight in 2020 and choosing 2020 as the future year?
Of course, we usually talk about that. I mean, it's a fascinating phenomenon because we all have 2020 hindsight. And if you say to somebody, did the personal computer surprise you? Everybody says no. Mobile phone, no. But you know, I mean, I remember even in 92, 93, if you said to an executive, can you know, we're talking about mobile phones, and he says, you'll never catch me walking down the street talking to myself. That's what executives used to say. And now we all do it. I was actually, yesterday in Mexico City, I was just standing outside maybe the day before, standing outside the hotel, and there were people milling around everywhere. And you know that every one of these people was on a mobile phone. And isn't it, I mean, can you imagine? I mean, here all of us, why don't we talk to each other? You know? And everybody was on a mobile phone talking to somebody else. It's a world that actually 10 years ago was unthinkable, you know? So I think we always think we have, you know, perfect hindsight, but actually we don't apply that to the future because we just expect the future to be much like today, maybe a bit bigger and faster, you know. And it's these step changes that I think are so interesting for an executive team to explore. And you don't do that naturally in business. You know, normally we focus on today. And we have a sort of a rule that says, look, you should actually, as an executive team, you should spend 10% of your time. Clean sheet thinking. You know? And you might say, well, sure, that's fine, but that's 36.5 days a year. Okay, can you clear up 36.5 days of the year? And normally what we do is we take 18 days a year and work with an executive team. So just pick 18 days, we put the process together to create this view of the future. And I must tell you, in every case, one, it's a lot of fun, and number two, is it changes your view of what can be. And it's not that you have to work harder, it's that you work differently with twice the result. And that's really the trick, I think, in all of this. But it's to get out of this 2020 hindsight. We love looking backwards. It's really comforting. I mean, listen to old music, we look at our old business results, and the rest is really tough. The future's tough. I mean, it's not an easy thing to think about. Especially not with the same management team that's producing the results for this year. Okay.
There is another question.
Do you think the education the kids are getting today, is it proportionally any better than we got before? Or is it getting them ready for the future that you're talking about?
I think education equips our children to live in the past. I don't think that education, and it's not Mexico, this is generally, I think there's very little education available that actually equips our children to live in a future, because the people teaching them are backward looking. We don't pay teachers enough. We should treble teachers' salaries. In the Lessons from the Future book, there's a whole chapter on this. So, you know, everybody will tell you, yes, our kids are the most important thing we've got. But that's a lie. Look at what we pay teachers.
Yeah, teaching is more reactive than proactive.
Yeah. So to me, I think teaching should be the most highly paid occupation. And then, you know, we had this discussion with a few governments already. They said, but you can't pay teachers 3 times that. They're not worth it. See the logic here? So either your kids are important or they're not. If your kids are important, you've got to do it. And then you get some really good people going to become teachers. So, I mean, education is a big, big issue everywhere. I don't know if you know this, but in China, half of 14-year-old kids do not have access to education. So, you know, even in that environment where they produce all these engineers and everything, it's something that's still very exclusive. Half the kids at age 14, no education. So, I'm very pessimistic about it, but it takes very strong government action, and it's still, you know, at the moment government is still responsible for education. You know, we will probably all have read about a time when the church was responsible for education, and we gave it to government. And I think at some stage we're going to give it to the private sector. If you look at the United States now, the half of the postgraduate studies are being done within companies. You know, sort of General Electric has a university and so on. And in Sweden and in the UK now, there's a lot of commercialization of education through education vouchers. So that, in other words, the state doesn't provide the money to the schools. They give the money to parents, and parents can choose which school to give the money to. And that changes the world as well, because then if your school's not performing, you get no money. If the teachers don't, if the parents don't like the school disappears. And that is, you know, putting commercial forces into education. But, you know, it's education very often is very politicized, of course, as well. So, yeah.
Going to that same question, are there any universities that are moving forward into this thinking of not learning from the past, but guessing the future?
You know, to me, there are bits within universities that do that.
Which would you say are the best from that?
There are a couple that I've worked with that I really think are good. I'm not going to make that comment because half of those universities are also not good. You know, so it's individuals within, you know, whether you look at Harvard or wherever you look. I mean, Harvard, to me, 70% of Harvard is in the industrial age. I mean, they're the only places on the planet that they still use overhead foils. You know, because the teachers are so old that they've not actually kept up with. And you know, you look at a class like that, they're scrabbling around and the kids are sitting on their mobile phones testing what they've just been told is still valid. You know, and the teacher will get a question that they can't answer because they didn't realize that last week something changed, but the kids do. So to me, that's the problem, is that the teaching fraternity is not right up there where they should be. And that's the point of a teacher, is to be leading, not to be dragged kicking and screaming by the students into the 21st century. So, yeah. But how do you fix it? That's a big, big problem. You know, so it has to be driven by the consumer, I think, like most of markets today. The consumers are the kids. You know, who would have kids run a school? But they can teach teachers a lot, I think. Okay, I think we've run out of time.
Just one question
Yeah.
that I believe can be interesting to look. If you remember on Mexico City's presentation, one of the undersecretaries for one of the federal agencies asked you then, so what's next? What would this, no? I mean, it was a good question.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fairly straightforward question for us. I think if you believe that you should spend, say, 10% of your time understanding the future as an executive team, as a family, or as a country, then, you know, dedicate that time. And, you know, typically, if you can give us, for example, a day a month, we will bend your mind and create a business strategy that you won't believe. But it is all founded on spending these clear days thinking about what does nanotechnology mean for my business, whether I'm in the paint business, in the soft drinks business, in cars, or whatever. What does this technology mean? And so what we would do typically in a day like that is bring 2 or 3 experts from around the world to talk about not what the technology is, because that's irrelevant, But to give you a scenario that says, my view of 2020, or whatever year you choose, is the following. In other words, this is the effect that nanotechnology will have had on the world. And you will get another one to give you a totally different view of the effect of that particular subject. So you end up with an executive team that has to now rationalize 3 different futures in the same area, all from the best brains on the planet. Because that's the reality. You know, that picture of the sea going crazy, that's what we have to manage as an executive team. But the only way you can do that is to be exposed to all the different views of the future. So, you know, to me, it's to dedicate the time. Well, before that, is the future important to you? I mean, we're going to spend most of the rest of our lives there, I think, unless you've got somewhere else to go. I don't know. But if the future is important, then dedicate some time to it. And if you want some outside help, well, that's what we do, is to get the brain cells going, and then to result after that, to focus then on, so what does it mean for my business? Because that, you know, it's divergent thinking all these crazy thoughts, and much crazier than today, by the way. And then, you know, bring it all together and say, okay, so what does this mean for our business? Where are the opportunities? Where are the threats? What do we do next? Is that what you want?
Yeah, that was the question.
Okay.
Bueno, pues muchas gracias. Gracias por haber estado aquí con nosotros. Y estaba aquí Wolfgang un rato más. Si quieren acercarse con él, tener una plática 1 a 1.